Welcome, friends, to another edition of Global Capitalism, a bi-monthly presentation brought to you by Democracy at Work, the organization I work with, and the Left Forum, two organizations that work together a great deal and that together bring these presentations to you. I'm particularly proud that we're bringing it to you as we normally do on the second Wednesday of every other month, because we're back on schedule. Democracy at Work, particular, has had a very difficult spring of this year. Growing pains erupted into serious internal organizational difficulties. I am very happy to tell you that we are over them now. We're back. We're back on schedule. We are able now to do all we've done before, and we will be rolling out new activities I think you will find exciting. If you wish more information, just go to our website, newly designed, by the way. Democracyatwork.info is where you go, and you will see what some of the new directions and new initiatives that we are rolling out and will continue to do in the weeks ahead. Today's presentation is about a historical change of extraordinary importance. We're living through it. We will be living through it for quite a while. It's nothing less than a shift of modern capitalism from a tendency in most cases to shy away from endorsing and supporting a powerful authoritarian state. The shift is now to embrace that, to welcome an authoritarian state, to push it to be, if anything, more authoritarian. What do I mean is part of what I will begin, but what it implies for all of us is what I will concentrate on. To begin, let's be clear about what we mean by capitalism. It is that particular economic system, different from slavery, different from feudalism, different from a variety of other economic systems. And the key difference is the way capitalism organizes production, the production of the goods and services upon which every modern society depends. Indeed, every past society did as well. Capitalism organizes it as follows. A very small group of people, quite a small minority, are called employers. They are the ones who decide exclusively what each workplace will produce, what technology it will use, where the production will take place, and what will be done with the output. On the other side of every workplace is the big majority. Those people are called employees. They do the overwhelming bulk of the work, the actual production of goods and services. But they are excluded from the decisions what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the net output. Those decisions made by the employers explain, of course, why they are politically in the driver's seat in capitalist societies, why they are the ones that become wealthy, whereas the employees in general don't, etc., etc. You are all familiar, since you all live, as I do, in capitalist systems. And why do I focus on the relationships of people in production? Because that's the key difference. Feudalism didn't have employers and employees. Employers didn't exist in feudalism. Nobody hired workers. The relationship was completely different. The lord and the serf were bound together by religious obligations, personal obligations. Slavery was different yet again. There we didn't have employers and employees either. We had masters and slaves, and the slaves were the property of the masters, as were all the other inputs to production. What the systems do have in common, though, is that small group at the top, employers, feudal lords, masters, and a vast army of people underneath them doing the bulk of the work, slaves, serfs, and employees. Now, in modern capitalism, particularly that in the West, we refer to it often with the adjective private capitalism. And I want to begin by talking about how private capitalism is turning more and more to an authoritarian state. And my focus is going to be on the United States because of its leadership and importance in the world of private capitalism. And all the word private means is that the capitalists, the employers, are not operatives of a state. They don't hold a position in a government. They are not a state official of any kind. They are private individuals who undertake privately run, owned production. And they have been, for most of the history of capitalism, leery of authoritarian states. They were not interested in them. They wanted the state to be weak, distant, and mostly to leave the private capitalist alone. They used the French phrase, leave me alone, laissez-faire, to describe the kind of capitalism they endorsed. And private capitalism has been the norm in the United States, Western Europe, Japan, the old centers of capitalism over the last century or two. Why then might they today be turning to an authoritarian state? What do I mean by an authoritarian state? I mean a state that is not only allowed, but welcomed to intervene in the economy in all kinds of ways that used to be taboo, that used to be opposed by private capitalists. Far from opposing it, now most of them welcome it. Yes, there are groups that still are leery about this and don't want it. It's not universal, but the shift is unmistakable. And I'm only going to have time to give you some examples of the shift as it's going on. One way to understand it is to recognize that words which were until recently celebrated are now denounced. Globalization. We were told from the 1960s onward that as corporations expanded around the world, they could become more efficient. They could get closer to the sources of inputs they needed, the natural resources, and so on. They could take advantage of lower wages to cheapen the prices of things we here in the United States or Western Europe or Japan consume, and so on. Globalization made capitalism more dynamic, more efficient. We were to celebrate it, and our political leaders, Republican and Democrat alike, fell all over themselves cheerleading for globalization and for the other big term, neoliberalism, whose idea was simply let these companies go around the world. Don't hold them back. Don't limit them. Don't regulate them. Let them go. Notice again, laissez-faire. Let them go. Let the private folks do what they want. The government should keep out of it. And the corporations went. They went all over the world, particularly to China, because the wages there were much lower than in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. And the market in China was growing faster than in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. And if capitalists know anything, they know that if you want to succeed in competition, you better go where the wages are lowest and the market is growing fastest, because that's where you will succeed. Well, the problem is, over the last 30 to 40 years, as capitalists globalized, going to China as well as many other countries, and that was true not only of American capitalists, but of Western European and Japanese capitalists as well, the Chinese managed the process quite differently from the way other countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the so-called Global South, how they had managed it. The Chinese made sure it would go to the advantage of development in and by China. So that by today, China has demonstrated that it got a bigger set of gains out of neoliberal globalization than the countries that invented and produced neoliberal globalization. A kind of surprise has dawned on the world. And why am I telling you this? Because you probably already know it. I'm telling you it because the competition from China, particularly, but also now from its allies, particularly the so-called BRICS, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. China and these allies are now a bigger economic powerhouse than the G7, which is the United States and its allies in Western Europe, plus Canada and Japan. The BRICS alliance produces about 33% of the world's output. The United States and its G7 alliance produce about 29%. In many fundamental ways, the dominance of the old Western centers of capitalism, Western Europe, North America, and Japan, is over. And they have been and will continue to be replaced by the ascendancy of the BRICS alliance. To give you simply one indication, economic growth this year, 2023, is expected to be between 0 and 0.2% in Europe. In the United States, it's expected to be between 1 and 2%. In the People's Republic of China, it's expected to be between 5 and 5.5%. Inflation in Europe is devastating, over 10% for the area. In the United States, it's bad, but 5%. The inflation rate in the People's Republic of China this year is 0.7%. There is no contest. Why am I telling you this? Because the United States' reaction, and that of Europe as well, to the rise of China and the BRICS has been a major adjustment in the direction of wanting the activity of an authoritarian state. In the place of neoliberalism and globalization, we are turning to economic nationalism. Here are some of the signs that I'm sure you've noticed. The United States is demonizing China, top to bottom, reminiscent of the Cold War when that was done to the Soviet Union. The United States is punishing selected Chinese companies. The United States government is threatening and sanctioning enterprises and governments around the world that trade with China. The United States is forbidding export of private companies' private outputs to China, particularly in the area of microchips. I could go on. President Trump hit China with tariffs, making every Chinese product more expensive in the United States because you had to pay not only the price of the good, but the tariff tax added by the United States on top of it. We have trade wars. The Biden administration has continued them. There is a governmental interference in our economy which would have made earlier generations totally outraged because it violates the notion that private capitalism is best left alone by a non-interfering, non-intervening government. Well, that's only the beginning of the story. The reality is that the United States' empire, the building up of which happened particularly after the Second World War, when the United States replaced the old colonial masters in Western Europe and Japan with its new informal empire. We didn't have colonies, with a few exceptions, but we very similarly managed The United States has hundreds of military bases around the world in a way no other country has. No other country comes close. We operate an empire, and that empire is in deep trouble. It's shrinking. The war the United States went into in Korea ended in a kind of stalemate, not a victory. The war in Vietnam, an attempt to maintain the empire over there, the United States was flat out defeated. In Afghanistan, again. In Iraq, basically, again. Much of the pressure leading the United States to be so actively involved in the Ukraine war is also an attempt to hold on to a dominant world position that is in trouble, is shrinking. Like every other empire in the history of the world, this one, having been born, having grown, having evolved, is now in decline. And turning to a government is what capitalists here do, hoping to slow, if not stop and reverse, that decline. And we have internal troubles that are getting worse and worse because we have a real competitor in China, because our empire is shrinking. We don't have the kind of wealth growth that other parts of the world do. And that means the pie isn't getting larger so that everybody can get a bigger piece. Those who are rich and powerful in the United States hold on in a shrinking situation to what they have. But if they do, if the pie is getting smaller, but the people at the top are holding on to what they had, then the people who aren't at the top are going to suffer a diminution, a decline in the standard of living. The mass of Americans are paying for the costs of a dying empire and of a serious competitor economically in China and the BRICs. And here are the forms of that shifting of the burden to the mass of people. The inflation, which raises the price of everything you buy without raising your income the same amount, so you can afford less. It's a way of distributing less goods and services to the mass of people. Cutting back government supports. Let's be clear. President Biden accepted 2 years of no increase in the budget for governmental programs for the mass of people. Well, if prices are going up at 5% a year, but you haven't allocated 5% increase each of the next 2 years, which is what Biden didn't do, well, then you are dictating a shrinkage of the quality and quantity of public services to the mass of the American people. Since inflation is already shrinking what they can afford to buy themselves, the addition of a government austerity, which is what this is a way in which you burden the mass of people for the challenge. And you know what that does, predictably? It causes bitterness, anger, upset in the mass of people. They were told if they work hard and go to school, they will enjoy a rising standard of living. They aren't. They were told they would be able to catch that American dream. They can't afford it, and they know it. The rents are out of control. The prices are out of control. The government isn't helping me more. I can't pay back my loans. I can't. The condition of the American working class is in deep trouble. And that has allowed demagogic politicians to cash in, to find a scapegoat. Immigrants, that's popular, as if that was the problem. Or China, as if that was the problem, rather than how the United States deals with a competitor. That's the serious position we are in. And we're getting a divided society. Some people know that what has to be done is, say, to relieve students of their debts, to relieve homeowners and others of their debts. People know. We need more funding so that colleges don't cost what they now do. We need all kinds of help to afford higher priced food and shelter. We know what we need, but we're not getting it, and that's dividing the country. Some people want to push for better help for people to get along. Others want to keep immigrants out of the country. Those are very different reactions to the same squeeze that the mass of people. And you know who's called upon to deal with it? A big, powerful government. All kinds of resources are given. Build walls along the southern border. Hire huge numbers of people to harass folks coming across the border, push them back, as if that will solve our problems, which, of course, it never does. Our problems are structural. They have to do with the way our economy is organized. They have nothing to do with the sad, poor people trying to come to the United States for the same reasons that people have come here for a century or two. It's remarkable. To hold on to the empire, we're getting more and more involved in wars around the world. To deal with the social divisions, we're giving more and more power to the government. Our police are funded more and more. The police are active in our communities. The government now doesn't hesitate to tell you whether you can or cannot have an abortion. All kinds of things the government is undertaking to do. And yes, you hear the voices of the old conservatives who are opposed, but they're not stopping the process. It's mostly show. The reality is the government is getting more and more money. That's why we have the enormous deficits in our budget. What the government cannot tax because of the political opposition, it borrows from the same rich people and corporations who already have the dominant voice in what our government does. The inequality here in the United States adds to the social tension, and frightened people who have wealth look to the government to protect it. So all kinds of people, the poor want the government to help them. They're in a situation where they don't survive otherwise. We have a growing homeless problem. We have an enormous problem called food insecurity because our government dare not say the word we all understand better, which is called hunger. No, this is a society torn apart inside. That's why our politicians scream at each other. That's why nobody listens to the other side. There's no time, there's no space left. It's a society in trouble. Its internal tensions and contradictions are making the capitalists who used to keep the government relatively powerless are changing to make it more and more powerful. And we may like it or not like it, but the process is well underway, and it isn't going to stop anytime soon. You can see it even in the military, busy fighting a war in Ukraine that apparently, according to President Biden, has made us, I quote, run out of ammunition, is busy provoking China in the South China Sea, right where they are, over this issue of Taiwan. Really? Are we going to fight a war there too? Are we going to risk it? Are we going to have a war between Russia and NATO? We are taking chances as a government that are extremely dangerous. And in a few minutes, I'm going to show you that there is a way to understand this process by looking at a very similar process at the end of feudalism. But before I do that, I want to turn and show that the powerful authoritarian government is also at work in the places in the world where capitalism isn't private, but is rather a state activity. I'm going to use as my example the other big economic power in the world today, the People's Republic of China. Now, here we see a society that is a mixture of private enterprise, private capitalism. And why do I call it private capitalism? Because it's private enterprises with a small minority of people who own and run it, and a large number of people who do the work. Those who own and run it are called employers, and those who do the work are called employees, and one hires the other. It's the capitalist system, whatever else it's called. And alongside that private capitalism, partly owned and operated by Chinese private individuals, and partly owned and operated by foreign, non-Chinese, Japanese, Western Europe, North American, and so on. Alongside the private enterprises, there are state enterprises, enterprises owned and operated by the Chinese government at one or another of the levels of that government. I call them state capitalism. Why? Because they again adopt the same employer-employee organization of their enterprises, their factories, offices, and stores. They have chosen to do that. And for that reason, I call them capitalist, because they got that model from the capitalism of the rest of the world. Now, the Chinese call it socialism. Particularly, they call their society socialism with Chinese characteristics. Here's what they mean: that it's a mixture, as I've described it, of private and state enterprises. And that mixture is overseen, is controlled from above by a powerful communist party and the state government that is ultimately controlled by that party. So that's a very interesting model, quite different from the United States, which doesn't have a large sector called state-owned and operated enterprises, and doesn't have a powerful communist party, and is only now beginning to support an authoritarian state. So the Chinese already have one. So they're not, in a way, turning towards more of it, because they already, in a sense, have it. But why are they determined to hold on to it, as they clearly are, as you can see from the activities of the Chinese government and the leadership of the Communist Party? Well, there are two answers to that question. Here's the first one. The Chinese system has worked spectacularly for them. If this is not understood, most of the rest of what people are telling you in the media about China will be incomprehensible. And since the media don't like to say what I'm about to explain to you, that's why so much of it is incomprehensible. What enabled the Chinese to develop their own economy into the powerhouse it is today, along the way lifting 800 million people out of poverty, and some of the worst poverty the world had ever seen. And let's remember, 800 million Chinese, that's more than the population of the United States and Western Europe combined. And they became a powerhouse, and they can match the high-tech industries of the United States. Unbelievable. What did that was their particular model, the mixture of private capitalist enterprises, state capitalist enterprises, and a powerful authoritarian government and state coordinating and instructing and supervising and regulating that mixture of private and state enterprises. They're the model for every poor country in the world. How do you want to become not poor? How do you want to become big, rich, powerful? The Chinese are the model of models. And that's one of the reasons so many other countries are busy applying for membership in the BRICs these days. They want to go to where it seems the effort to get out of poverty works fastest and best. I am not endorsing Chinese society, politics, civil liberties, or the absence thereof. I'm talking about economics because we're concerned with the relationship between the capitalist economic system, employer-employee organization on the one hand, and a powerful state on the other. I told you there was a second reason for why the authoritarian state is already a fixture in the state capitalisms of the world. It's because of the socialism of the 19th and 20th centuries, this idea of a society beyond, after capitalism, tended to focus on the government. Socialists tended to be those who felt that the failures and flaws of capitalism could and would and should be offset, overtaken, overthrown by having a powerful government do for the mass of people what a private capitalism failed to do. In other words, socialism was associated, as I'm sure many of you still do, with a powerful state. So if that's what you thought socialism was, and you made a revolution like the Chinese did in 1940, the late 1940s, culminating in their victory in 1941, then the system you set up has a strong state in the hands of a communist party. That's the logic of what socialism meant in those days. So there we have it. We have a combination of an already established authoritarian state in the state capitalisms of China and more countries like that. And we have the turn from a formerly more private capitalism to a more and more powerful state. Together with private capitalism, there's still a hesitancy in the private capitalist countries of the world, like the United States, United Kingdom, and so on, not to let the state do in those countries what it already does in places like China. But the authoritarianism, the turn towards it in the old private capitalism and the already established authoritarian state in the state capitalist parts of the world, tell us what I said to you at the beginning, that we are in a historical time when an authoritarian state is becoming the dominant model, the dominant trend, the dominant feature of the world we are moving into. So, given that, let me ask the key question. Will an authoritarian state save capitalism, or will it end capitalism? Now, why do I ask this question? Because I said the question that history presents us with. And to make this point, I'm going to spend a few moments showing you how, in the end of feudalism, the 17th, 18th century particularly, when feudalism died as a system and gave birth to capitalism as the next system, something very similar happened that will allow me to answer this question for capitalism, because I can show you what happened when feudalism came to an end. Feudalism in Europe, usually dated to begin around the 6th, 7th century after Christ, was a very decentralized system. You might call it a private feudalism, in which lords were many, scattered across the European countryside, each with a few serfs, maybe a bunch of serfs, maybe many serfs, but there was no state, there was no real government. The only thing that held Europe together was loosely the Roman Catholic Church that had come out of the end of slavery, Roman slavery, as the only kind of big global for Europe institution. Long story short, feudalism for its early centuries was a system in which lords exploited serfs, but they did so as private enterprises, which is what each feudal manor was. But as the system evolved, as it grew, it became full of internal contradictions, bitternesses on the part of serfs at the dictatorial position over them that the lords exercised. Anger by the serfs when the lords needed more and squeezed the serfs, so they had to work harder and keep less of what they produced, giving more in payments to the lord. Payments, by the way, that were called rents. That squeezing for rent is not a new phenomenon. And what did the lords do when, predictably, the squeezing of the peasants produced a reaction? Bitterness, anger, which erupted in peasant rebellions. The peasants, after all, were many. The lords were few, and that's very dangerous if the few are rich and powerful and use their power to squeeze the many. And what the frightened feudal lords did is, here we go, turned to government. They made one of their number, one of the feudal lords, one of the big ones, into something higher yet. They called that big lord a king. That's the origin of monarchy. And the king was to be given the extra power, the taxes, the shares of other lords, to be powerful enough to squelch, to control, to block, to stop the revolutions of serfs from below. In other words, feudalism evolved a powerful authoritarian state to cope with the desire for the system to survive, to avoid the blowing up of the lord-serf feudal system of production. That's why if you read about the 17th and 18th century in Europe, you read about things called absolute states, the Louis in France, the kings this and that in Britain, and the kings and queens all over Europe. These were powerful states, a kind of authoritarianism of the state that was created out of feudalism's evolution as an attempt to save the system from its own internal explosions. And they fought each other because the British monarchy competed with the French, and they both competed with the Austro-Hungarian or the Prussian or the Italian, and on and on. Rather like the competition between the United States and China, with the Europeans watching in the wings and the Japanese too. Competition weakened the authoritarian states, so they were less able to control the revolution inside. What finally defeated British monarchy, French monarchy, and so on, were eruptions from inside. The French Revolution, the English revolutions, and so on. So to answer the question I posed, the turning to authoritarian states in feudalism both allowed the system to survive for centuries longer than it could have otherwise, and yet those absolute states were also the beginning of the end. The revolutions in England, the revolutions in the United States, the revolutions in France were all directed against the powerful king. That absolute state came to stand for everything that people didn't want anymore to continue. The American Revolution of 1776 was directed against George III, King of England. The famous revolution in France in 1789 was directed against Louis, the King of France, and so on. So it turns out that the turn to authoritarianism in feudalism was both a way to save it and a way to end it. So the answer to the question I would propose to you Is the turn towards authoritarianism going to save capitalism, or is it going to end it? My proposal to you is to answer with the word, it's going to do both. It will keep it going for a while. It will solve some problems that might have been explosive if the government hadn't stepped in. For example, the last 2 years have been a devastating inflation for the American working class. The government stepped in and extraordinarily raised interest rates very fast over the last 18 months. That's going to lose millions of people their job, but it seems to be bringing down inflation. It's a problem. It gives the government yet more power. It makes all kinds of people critical of the government, and in the long run, that's quite dangerous. But it gets them out of the mess of an inflation, at least for a while. The attempt under Trump to let the private sector deal with the pandemic was such a complete failure that the government had to come in a massive way, freaking the people out by the government mandates and the government controls and the government. But that was the way to cope when it was clear that other countries were coping with COVID way better than the United States. The death statistics, more Americans died than in many countries with a much less developed medical system. That's not because our medical care isn't all that good. It's because the way we organize who gets to access medical care and who doesn't is a big problem we are afraid as a nation to address. Too much obstacle from private capitalists. Well, then where are we left? Well, we're left with wondering how far the turn to the authoritarian state is going to go. You know, the American government has been punishing Chinese companies. It's been punishing American companies that do business of various kinds in and with China. Where will that stop? Why would we expect that the American government won't begin to choose and play favorites among American companies here, favoring one region or another, one industry or another, one company or another? Is the effort of the government to shape family life, which is powerful, is that going to continue? Are we going to be told that if you're trans or if you're gay or if, then you don't get this, you do? The government is being brought in to block, to change, to stop, to intervene. Wow. The government is becoming the plaything for everyone with a special interest to get what they want when they can't get it without the government stepping in. No one knows the answers to these questions. But we do know that the world is becoming a very dangerous place because nationalism here in the United States adds one of the most powerful countries in the world to the list of countries focused on their national needs and therefore bumping into other countries focusing on theirs, introducing frictions for which the answer in the past has been war. And in the present, also war, held back by a fear of nuclear war in which the absurdity of all of this ends us all. And we are at that point of fearfulness with a rational foundation because capitalism cannot survive otherwise. That is the single most important message of this presentation. The problems of capitalism, especially in its old centers, Western Europe, North America, and Japan, are producing conflicts, tensions, scapegoating, bitterness, and divisions that threaten the future of capitalism. And yet all that's happening is more and more turning to the government to solve the problem, which is how we got in to this level of authoritarianism in the first place. In other words, it's not slowing down and it's not stopping. What has this then finally to do with the old question of socialism? China calls itself socialist. There's no agency in the world that determines who can and cannot call themselves socialist. For China, they have socialism with Chinese characteristics. And that means in China a mixture of state and private capitalist enterprises overseen, supervised, controlled, and regulated by a powerful authoritarian state and communist party. Right now, that is the rising economic system of the world, the focus of the global south. The vast majority of people in the world look there now. Every poor country planning an economic development program now has two places to go for help. They used to have to go to the West, Western Europe, North America, and Japan. They can go there. There are some resources for them there, but they can also go to China and the BRICs. And more of them are going in that second direction now than are going in the first. And visits by Janet Yellen to this or that part of the world, or by Mr. Blinken or anybody else, are not going to change that. They're window dressing in a process far enough along that we can be confident it's not going to change anytime soon. Well, are we stuck there? Is that what we have? Is the United States, in fact, more and more moving in the direction of a capitalism with an authoritarian state? Are we moving in a direction that might have a merger in which the big capitalist corporations and the government become intertwined? There is a name for that because we had in the 20th century the beginning of efforts in that direction. When German capitalism collapsed in the Great Depression, they turned in an authoritarian way to the government of Adolf Hitler, who gave us a good lesson in how far authoritarianism can go in merging the top private capitalists, the Krupps and the Thyssen's and the others in Germany, with the German government. Fascism is the name for that merger. Mussolini did something similar in Italy. Franco did something similar in Spain. We are now doing something similar. The merging of big business and the government. The WikiLeaks of the Twitter files showed us how closely the Twitter executives and government agencies worked as to what Twitter would and wouldn't allow the public of the United States. Well, who's controlling? It's not the Twitter. It's not the government. It's Twitter and the government working together. That is the direction in which we are going. Is the only socialism then we can imagine something like what we're seeing? And if so, doesn't that support the idea that socialism is not something progressive people are going to be drawn to? I think the answer, and it's very important, to that question is no, because socialism is not exhausted as an idea or as a tradition by a celebration of a powerful state. Did socialists do that? Yes. In the conditions of the second half of the 19th and the 20th century, socialism came to mean for most people a powerful state, offsetting the harsh edges of private capitalism. And in some cases, like the Soviet Union, taking over private capitalism to reduce its harsh edges. But that was never the only meaning of the term socialism. Here's another one, becoming more and more important in response to everything I have said about the turn toward authoritarian states. There's a socialism that says that turn, happening because of the internal contradictions and problems of capitalism, would not have to make that turn if those problems and contradictions of capitalism, its inequality, its instability, which crashes every few years, its neglect of the environment, its damage to human relationships, we wouldn't have those problems and therefore have to turn or try to turn to an authoritarian state if we dealt with those problems in a different way. And this strain of socialism says what it means. And here it is. We have to, say these socialists, change the organization of production. We have to go back to the basics. If capitalism is the relationship between employer minority and exploited majority employees, if it has that structure in common with the lord and the serf and the master and the slave, then that's the problem. That the solution to the difficulties, the inequalities of capitalism is to not allow that basic structure to continue. If a tiny minority runs the business, of course they will take the bulk of the profits for themselves. They'll become the rich. And the employee who doesn't get a cut of the profit won't be able to do likewise. And there we have the division between the rich and the poor in capitalism, the capitalist way of reproducing inequality, which we know more and see more around us now than perhaps in the history of capitalism. You want to get rid of that? Get rid of the employer-employee structure. Substitute an old idea of socialism, that the workplace should be a democratic collective. Every person at a workplace has an equal vote. Democracy in the workplace. Not just democracy where we live so we can choose the mayor, the congressperson, the president. Democracy in the workplace so we can choose what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and we can together decide what we're going to do with the fruits of our labor. Are we going to give a lot of them to the 2 or 3 people at the top, the Elon Musks of this world? Or are we going to say, we all help to produce the output, we all get a reasonable share? Not some people sending rockets to the moon or to the bottom of the ocean when other people cannot feed themselves, send their kids to school, etc. No, 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 no. Democratic workers together wouldn't divide the wealth that way. We wouldn't have anything like the inequality we have now. Yeah, there are solutions that don't require you to stay with the private capitalism we had before or to make the turn with that capitalism to authoritarian states now. Those are not the only options. A return to some other theories and strains and tendencies inside socialism, particularly the one that has to do with dealing with the workplace, the factory, the office, the store, to democratize it in order to break the power that is wielded by that employer minority. A final thought that reiterates something I have said before. Once upon a time, we believed, many of us, our ancestors, that you needed to have a king, somebody who was constantly in touch with God and who ruled over us as his subjects. Because if we did away with the king, the society would fall apart. It wouldn't have a leader. It wouldn't have a guide. It wouldn't have somebody talking to God. Well, at a certain point, most of us in most countries got rid of the kings and queens. The few that are left are mostly figureheads, ceremonials, no real power. We got rid of kings, and guess what? Society didn't fall apart. Civilization didn't unravel. We didn't all die in a terrible fire. Well, the kings and queens we thought we got rid of fooled us. They changed their names and reappeared somewhere else, and now we have them trapped. Here's their new name, CEO. Inside the enterprise, they are the king. They have an unchecked power. They can do pretty much whatever they want without with enormous impact on the employees, but the employees have no power over them. They don't elect them. They can't recall them. In fact, if they say boo, the CEO can have them fired. You think there are unions who protect? Where there are unions, they have a hard time protecting. And in the private sector, where our CEOs are, 6% of American employees are members of a union. The other 94% have no union to protect them. We got rid of the kings, and our political lives didn't fall apart. We can get rid of the kings inside our workplaces, and our workplaces will not fall apart, and they will produce as good or better than they did before. But we will not have many of the worst problems of this society that come directly out of the employer-employee organization of capitalism. Capitalism in private enterprises, but capitalism also in state enterprises. And the question remains for all of us in the private capitalist economies that are still that, and in the state capitalist economies. What about that socialist demand for the democratization of the workplace? My guess is the very success of what the Chinese have achieved in economic development is producing a working class in China, which, like the working class in Western Europe, North America, and Japan, will experience the contradictions that afflict a system structured the way capitalism has. And they will rediscover the old socialist idea that the best solution to the problems of capitalism, private or state, are to question, to challenge, and to go beyond imagining that we have to organize the production process with a minority running the show and a majority doing the work. It is coming to the fore as a central question, and the process of moving to ever more authoritarian states may allow the capitalism a bit more life, but it also brings that capitalism, as it brought feudalism before, closer and closer to the demands it cannot meet, and that will mean it has to give birth to a new, different, and better system. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you will watch with me the evolution of this authoritarian turn in capitalism, and that we will together be able to explore the alternatives I ended with as the best way forward for the human race at this time. Thank you.